Hey, it's Dorky. What if you're back with another video? Like, sub because there is more coming. Let's start. Izuku Midoriya remembered coming across a checkbox calendar on line 1. It followed through each day of the year, like a graph the way it was formatted, and to its side was a color indicator, a list of colors representing an emotion or outlook on experiences. People were meant to fill in the boxes with the color that best represented their day, and apparently it was to motivate them to work on making bad days followed by better days until those were what remained. Izuku decided to download it to his computer, mainly out of sheer curiosity if it could work for him, and for about 3 weeks he got a good sense of how to use it. That wasn't a good experience, by any means of the imagination. Too many of his days ended up mediocre at best, and downright awful at worst. Red and orange dictated almost the whole column of the month of June, and he was about ready to just give it up. It wasn't that he wasn't trying hard enough. It wasn't that he put in no effort to make his days better. No one would let him make his days better. Namely, Kaken wouldn't let him better his days. Not all men are created equal was a line Midoriya got tired of hearing, because the reality of it was much less dramatic on his life than the spun everyone took on it. For the most part, it was right, people are not created equally. Not in the sense that they all had to be born looking and averaging out the same as a newborn, but that some babies were born with differences. Some babies were born without the luck to grow up healthy from a birth deficiency given to them in their mother's womb. Some didn't get to grow up. Then there were the people like Izuku. Izuku, by no stretch of the imagination, thought he was worse off than the people who were born with illnesses and disabilities, but he was certain everyone tried to make him think as such. Not a day went by that a voice didn't call out to him just to ridicule him. Not a day went by when someone didn't remind him of how useless he was as a quirkless. Not a day went by that Kaken wasn't there to make him remember his place in the world. And he hated to think about that. He hated to think about Kaken's voice, playing in his ears as the two students talked at the end of class, and the one with a quirk capable of generating explosions from the palms of their hands telling the one without a power to swan dive off a rooftop and die and hopefully find a quirk via rebirth. With the window in front of Izuku wide open, as the green-haired teen stared down in despair at the hero notebook scorched and landing in a fish pond, the blonde still had the nerve to yell it to him. And Izuku listened. And Izuku rejected. Izuku was, by no stretch of the imagination, smart. He was a capable kid, exceeding in his academics in school and holding positions in the top 5 on every subject with his peers. Even if Kaken was the one sitting at the top of their grades, he wasn't about to start taking any advice that advocated suicide and distraught. The amount of damage that would do to not only Izuku, but his mother in the school and Kaken and the Katsuki family wouldn't have been worth it. So Izuku ignored the voice of Kaken echoing in his ear to take the jump and took the stairs down instead, recovering his notebook for what it was worth and leaving the school grounds to go home. Only he didn't make it home. It seemed death was dead set on taking Midoriya's life and, seeing as how the teen wouldn't take it away himself, sent someone else to do it for him. In the form of a sludge-corked individual, Izuku found himself suffocating under a stone bridge, trapped in a gooey body with the slime form forcing itself into his body for control. And Izuku cried, as loud as he could with sludge in his mouth deafening his screams and tears mixing into the green liquid down his cheeks. He thought he would die. And the instant he had lost hope, pity entered the scene, shining under the sun in the form of All Might himself, the #1 hero in all the world, and capturing the slime villain in 2 empty soda bottles. Izuku was alive, but struggling to breathe, and several minutes with All Might's assistance to give him air and make sure he was at least mentally okay to not need a visit to the hospital helped him get back on his feet again. He even got All Might's signature in the ruined notebook. But Izuku wanted more. He needed more, and when All Might took a leap to leave, Izuku latched on to his leg and followed. The two landed atop a building, and their Izuku dropped the question of his future into the pro-hero's hands. Can I be a hero despite not having a quirk? Maybe the weight of the question was too much to bear on his shoulders, and All Might transformed in a puff of smoke into a figure not at all tall or muscular or smiling to give hope. His words had no hope to give. Ano could summarize the talk the hero and student had, before the two parted ways, on a sour note. It didn't hurt, the idea that Izuku could try to become something else that was meant for helping people, like a doctor or a police officer. That wasn't why the no hit him. The no hit him because it was a cherry on the top of the pile of no's he had heard for years, many of which were directed at him with harmful origin and malice. A pro-hero had added himself to the list of people telling him he could not become what he wanted to be, what he dreamed to be, and was better off letting the world decide his place in society. Had told Izuku to give up and submit to the cruelty he faced, even if the hero didn't know that was what he faced. That hurt. Sorrow hung over his shoulders and followed Izuku, or he may have been the one controlling where Izuku walked. He was uncertain himself why he had chosen not to head home straight away, but the universe was supposed to have a plan for everyone. And that day, its plan was to lead Izuku back into the clutches of the Slime Man. Or really back in close range to it, leaving Izuku to watch from the crowd as it aimed to do to Izuku on someone else, in the middle of a burning shopping district, with heroes on either side standing by unable to do anything to save the boy in its grasp. To save Kaken. So Izuku took control of his body again, and in doing so darted past the crowd and the heroes and straight for his classmate/bully and the monster of a person trying to suffocate the blonde menace. But Izuku could do nothing to stop them and free Kaken. Only for a moment could he stun the foe by knocking them in the eye, but it only lasted for so long before a whip of slime collapsed to Izuku. It never met with the boy, it never hit his skin. But it did meet skin. Specifically All Might's, as the hero stood over the green-haired boy to protect him and, with a single punch, saved the two boys and incapacitated the villain from attacking anyone else on its way to prison. Shame took a minute to step up, fueling the words of the heroes to make Izuku feel such, for stepping into the fray and nearly getting himself killed, for the second, third, fourth, Jesus, time that day. Not one acknowledged him for stepping up when the heroes refused to. Kaken took not a single look in his direction for stepping in to help. And a brief glimpse over his shoulder from All Might did nothing to help him feel good about the day or anything he had done. Izuku didn't have to go to the hospital, the first responders to the scene deemed him stable enough to head home with a warning from the heroes to stay out of trouble, and when he left with sorrow, regret, sadness, and anger haunting him. The feelings in his stomach were unsettling to move with, but Izuku didn't want to stop and hurl them into the nearest trash can. He just wanted to get away from everyone, if no one was going to step in to be with him. He could go to his mother, the only person who was on his side even if she didn't believe in his dream like everyone else, but with the way he was feeling and felt he was looking, the last thing he wanted to do was just worry her from the day he'd had. So Izuku walked away, sending quick texts sent to his mom telling her he would be home a bit later as he lied about going around town for a bit to study some heroes on their daily patrols. He walked out of the city, the tall buildings and towering businesses full of people that gave him no sense of safety, and traversed through a housing district beside it. The silence was the most comfortable aspect of his surroundings, but even it was haunting the boy's mind. For a while, aimlessness was all the boy had for supporting company, until a scent and sound washed over him from just a few blocks away. He diverted his attention and direction to the beach, calling out to him, disturbing the silence and unease over his shoulders as he approached. A hollow laugh found its way out of Izuku's mouth as recognition took his eyes, and the beach covered in trash became more obvious. Takoba Municipal Beach Park, he knew the place. Trash occupied the beach more often and in a much larger group than people ever did, enough to the point where people wouldn't visit at all if it wasn't to drop more trash. The place had turned into a dumping ground as the tide pulled up waste that no one made the effort to remove. Or at least a good quarter of it had turned into a mountain of trash, with little specks making their way down either end of the beach. That didn't make it any less abandoned, and it didn't make anyone who lived nearby interested in coming over to fix it. If Kaken was around, the explosive blonde probably would have congratulated Izuku on making it home. Ignoring the taunt he made in the back of his head, Izuku pushed onward onto the beach, easing himself down to the shore and joining the piles of trash flanking either side of him. His bag dropped to the sand behind him, and soon he followed suit, folding his arms over his legs and watching the sea as the sun shone in the sky behind him. The tide was calm, rising lightly onto the shore meters away from him, and the sound of the wind passing it by was calming, soothing, needed. Izuku closed his eyes with a deep breath and relaxed in his seat in the sand. That was what he wanted. Peace, and nothing but peace. Izuku rolled back into the sand and stared into the sky, watching the clouds roll by with his thoughts. No one believed in his dream. Not his classmates. Not his teachers. Not his peers. Not other heroes. Not All Might. Not his mother. Maybe he didn't either. He wanted it to happen more than anything as far as he could remember, but believing it would happen was a whole new stretch of land entirely untouched. There seemed to be no truth to it other than him already existing for it to be considered, much less plausible. So what could he do? What was he capable of? Izuku kicked up his feet and crossed them over one another. Maybe he could be a police officer. The profession would keep in contact with heroes all the time, or at least most of the time. Their freedom in tackling villains and situations more suited for heroes wasn't as free as a hero had it, but they had just as much responsibility at keeping people safe, only in different ways. His shoulders rolled as his hands cupped beneath his head. What about being a doctor? The profession was about equal to, if not more gruesome and graphic than being a cop. The situation was very much, well, situational. He'd have to really regulate himself to the sight of injuries far greater than he ever suffered if he wanted to work in that field, but the reward of being able to save people in far greater danger than being in the presence of a villain, also situational, would be worth it. Izuku frowned in a similar fashion of the cloud passing overhead, judging his choices as he did. He could very well go into those professions, but that wasn't the deal. The problem was the people around him, getting a reward out of their treatment of him and seeing Izuku give up the dream he had to do as they ordered him to. He'd only be making the bad people around him feel good about their actions. He couldn't do that, and by extension, couldn't run away to those jobs. He had to try to become a hero, if only to prove everyone wrong as they needed to be. But how would he ever accomplish that? He had no powers, no physical mutation, and no skills. Actually, the last one he could probably work with, given his analysis. If he aimed to be a field hero, he'd have to train and learn to fight, given his pencil of a body and limbs weren't capable of that kind of action by any means. He could maybe get his mother to sign him up for a self-defense class or martial arts class that could teach him those sorts of things. Would that be enough, just learning hand-to-hand combat? A scoff got Izuku to realize probably not. What else would he have to do then? Izuku rolled over and moved his head onto the fold of his arm. Maybe he could take up baseball? Izuku blinked and lifted his head as he looked over to the pile of trash on his left. He understood the piles contained a lot of useless junk no one wanted anymore, and he could see on the surface level of the pile alone that was true. But then why would someone throw away a perfectly good metal baseball bat? The green teen picked himself out of the sand and inched his way slowly to the baseball bat. His hands eased around the grip of the handle and lifted it from the sand with a fair amount of effort, looked back to the line of pencil arms. His brows furrowed as he rolled it in his hands and gave it a look over up and down. Aside from the sand staining the top, the bat was in perfect condition. It had no reason to be with the trash surrounding it. Izuku looked up to the pile it was leaning against, checking over every object he could isolate from those around them, looking to find anything in as good of a condition as it. But nothing was fine. Most anything with glass was cracked or broken open. Electronic appliances showed no signs of organization, with walls open and wipes pouring out in each and every direction. The closest thing to perfect was a still inflated tire of a truck, but even that looked worn out from use. Nothing on the bat was scratches or peeled or worn, not even the wrapping on the handle. It looked brand new. Izuku turned his body every which way, moving himself about and looking around the piles of trash, looking for anyone else in the area the bat could have belonged to. No one was around. No one but himself. And he saw no one leaving the beach as he entered, and no one was swimming out in the sea before him. He was alone with the bat. Midoriya stepped back to his stuff, swinging the bat weakly in his grip as he walked. His body swayed after it until he reached his bag and raised the bat to line up with his body. It was pretty thin for a bat, especially for its length, but it held its weight in his hands. For a moment he stood still, staring at the warped reflection of himself on the bat in his silence until a click rung in the back of his head to whiten his eyes. What else would he have to do to become a hero? Just using his hands wouldn't be enough. Just his regular human strength would only get him so far. His smarts were good, but they wouldn't always be helpful on the field if his body wasn't there to back up the actions he would have to take. He would need something else, something to help him accomplish more. Could a baseball bat do that? Izuku dropped into the sand again as the bat fell from his hands and he dug them through his back, pulling out a cleaner notebook that he used for class instead of the hero notebook in ruins. A baseball bat, what could he do with it? The object itself was basically used for swinging and hitting in a sport, but so could most anything of its shape and size, say a pole or a stick of wood. And there were weapons like that, poles of metal and wood using in martial arts from what he could remember off of action movies and the heroes he'd studied. They didn't always have to be used for just attacking, they could serve a purpose of blocking and disarming too. He'd seen people use various items made of metal to crack open locked doors, stick between closing doors to allow people to keep passing through, used with restriction in battle to only knock people out instead of bludgeoning them violently. If people could use long sticks and discs to fight people without acting out violently and in unwarranted ways, he could use a baseball bat made of metal. Besides, it wasn't like using a weapon was out of the question to begin with. Many pro heroes use tools and objects to fight off villains and robbers and really in bad person disrupting peace and lashing out at others. Their powers themselves were regulated and heavily lauded by the governments around the world, but heroes like Snipe with his revolvers and pistols and Midnight with her whip and, when he racked his brain hard enough to remember him, an underground hero by the name of Eraserhead using a tool akin to rope were allowed to fight without known quirks that enhanced their bodies. If they could get away with it, why couldn't he? Izuku smiled and curled in on his book as he rode away on the bat, and as his mind drifted to everything he thought he would need to do to make his dream of being a hero come true. He had something to work with, now he just needed to make sure it would work. He needed to make sure his own body would work too. He'd have to train extensively. UA's entrance exam would be in March, about 9 to 10 months away, but he could go online and find a workout routine or something to follow to get his body into shape if he couldn't find a fitness class for his mother to let him attend. That meant he would have to change his diet too, start eating foods that would help his body grow faster and stronger to get the strength he needed to be a hero and to use that bat. And speaking of the bat, he would have to learn how to fight with it, not just using it as a bat like he was a baseball player but using it in every way conceivable that could be used to fight villains and protect innocent people and himself. Maybe he could treat it like a staff or a sword, its shape already edging that of the other weapons. If he really couldn't get into a martial arts class, he could probably go online and find articles and videos to go off of and learn by himself. He'd been alone most of the time to being with, so it wouldn't be anything new. Izuku took in another breath as his back straightened out and he looked to the page of notes he was beginning to make for his dream. He could help but let a smile pull on his lips or his hands from shaking in excitement. It took more proper thoughts on how he could be a hero, maybe thanks to all the heroes around him telling him no and giving him a reason to reflect on what made them heroes. But he had something to work with. Plans to follow and ideas to cultivate and shape into a reality and a profession and a future. Maybe he could become a hero. The smile across his face lifted Izuku's head high, and his eyes were caught by the rays of the sun closing in on the buildings across from him. The day was getting late into the evening. His mom would be expecting him home soon. His body jerked from the memory and started cramming everything back into his bag as he stumbled back onto his feet. He darted across the sand and back up the steps before lagging at the top and running back down. He made way. Across again, heaving the bat out of the sand and into his arms before taking leave once again from the beach. Izuku Midoriya breathed out at the top of the steps, taking a turn on the balls of his feet to the shoreline and the trash hills once more with a smile he didn't want to fade away. He could be a hero. There was hope for him yet. God, was hope far away. And tiring. Very, very tiring. So, from the top of that night, Izuku got home in time for dinner not too later. His mother had questioned him, really hovered over him in doing so, about how he was and what he was doing. The news of the slime villain, as the news was calling him, had reached her through the TV not too long before he got home, and Inko was reasonably worried for her son and his health and safety. Izuku explained the quick notes of his day, meeting All Might and the villain in an order that wasn't true because he omitted to talk about what happened under the bridge and the more personal talk between him and All Might, but he was able to get it across how fine and alright he was. He was able to calm her down enough to trust his word and understand he would be fine. Then she noticed the bat and took a lead into conversing about it. Izuku didn't follow the conversation, and instead used its acknowledgement as a means to break into the conversation he wanted to have with his mom. Izuku wanted to learn self-defense, plain and simple. Not how to fight head-on, that could wait for the day his body was more capable to fight. He just wanted to learn how to defend himself from people attacking him, and maybe lead them or stall them so people more capable in combat could subdue them. He gave it thought on the way home, and while he could learn how to fight hand-to-hand too, he really didn't have the body to hit someone and get it to mean anything. He would have to improve, or really finally gain, muscle mass to be efficient in fighting. Besides, his mother would probably worry and advocate more against that idea given his current situation. But he could be passive with self-defense. Learning to fight without needing to throw a punch, to be quicker on his feet to avoid confrontation and contact. It would be a good place to start, to learn how to use his body and weight and improve himself and then improve it all over time. A way of avoiding the fight without having to run away and keep himself involved for the greater good. Tactical running. And to explain the bat, it would be a tool. He was familiar with some similar weapons in martial arts from media alone, and maybe he could learn those first and then translate them to the bat. He didn't have to use it for attacking, and the day he could wait for the future. He understood enough that if he wanted to fight to protect others he would have to keep himself protected to be there, so all of this is what he needed to learn first. He had to convince his mother to let him take a class to teach him what he needed to know, and assure her he would do everything in his power and the power he would grow in practice to keep himself safe for her. With hesitation and small amount of playing the devil's advocate, Inko complied, but with a few rules. The whole rest of the week would be nothing. They could look around online for a self-defense and martial arts class for school not too far from home, something Inko could afford with the money she had and that Izuku's father across seas was supplying them with. After the incident in the shopping district, and the bridge she wasn't made aware of, the last thing she wanted was to have Izuku going too fast into all this and jumping back into situations like that when he still wasn't ready to take action. Then, after the week of getting everything ready and giving Izuku time to breathe and accept everything he was asking, to make sure he truly wanted to do it all, he could take the class they found a few times a week, just so it wouldn't get in his way of school. He could take the class as long as he wanted to, until he either wanted to quit if he ever got second thoughts or until the possibility the money couldn't keep him attending. He would keep his training only on self-defense, and any combat sparring that went beyond those studies and teachings were to be avoided until both of them thought he was ready. And under no circumstances was he to be using that bat without learning how to wield a proper weapon, and that too could wait if it wasn't a part of his self-defense class. And Izuku agreed to it. To all of it. He wasn't offended by his mother helicoptering the whole ordeal, seeing as how her only child wanted to get into the heroics program and profession. It was a worry she probably shared with all parents with sons and daughters attempting to become heroes. Her worry was warranted, and Izuku didn't want to betray that or her, so he agreed to her terms. He'd take it slow and ease into the whole ordeal before picking it up to keep up with those around him attempting to become heroes. He promised. Izuku coughed into his sleeve, collapsing on the sand and swiping the water bottle from his bag. He took the whole week off from any confrontation and physical involvement that would get him in trouble and danger. Kaken was the only one who stepped close enough to make him feel threatened, but the blonde only yelled at him to back off next time there was danger, and not to butt in when he couldn't do anything. Words Kaken apparently wanted to say following the slime villain's attack, but never found Izuku around to tell him. Aside from that, the class around him kept their own distance too, some dropping their jeers towards him altogether and others lightening up on the teasing and bullying. It seemed Izuku getting involved with that incident unsettled the previous thoughts they had about him, all but one person's, and wrapping their minds around it, and the Izuku they showed on the news was still underway. They were beginning to think, at the very least amuse the idea, that Izuku was and could be heroic. It was a start. And in that week, outside of school and inside his room and on his computer, when Izuku wasn't studying for class and doing his homework, Izuku found himself working around his whole new plan to make himself a hero. Lucky enough for his mother, and especially himself, there was a martial arts school not too far from where they lived, a place that would take Izuku minutes to reach on the railways. Their training schedule was online too, and they had a block that was 2 hours long in the afternoon, for 2 days a week, that would focus specifically on teaching self-defense, jujitsu specifically. It wasn't a class about throwing a punch, which Izuku checked online and found quite a number of videos he could use to practice that form outside of class, but about disarming and pinning opponents. He ran it by his mom. The price of him attending both classes a week was manageable, and the class description fit the bill of what he was looking for and promised to focus on, and the distance from it to their home wasn't an issue. They went to the school later that week, to see the place for themselves and to meet the instructors. Inko, albeit reluctantly, made it clear that Izuku was quirkless and didn't have experience with martial arts prior, but the instructors had no problems with it. According to their rules, emitter quirks were forbidden in class, and any physical mutant quirks were to be minded at all times, with practice for and against those with enhanced physical abilities mixed into the classes if need be. And it wasn't required that Izuku had experience with martial arts, as long as he understood what he was and would be doing. Izuku explained that he did, and the lead instructor kept the talk going a little longer to learn of the whole situation and when Izuku would be attending their classes. The lead instructor of the school asked Izuku directly why he wanted to take their self-defense classes, and within his stuttering he explained the dream and drive he had to be a hero. He explained that he thought it would be smarter not to learn how to fight but how to stop the fighting, something the class description voiced similarly, and that helped draw Izuku into taking it. Heroes did know how to fight, but if he could learn how to do so in a means that was less messy and destructive to everything around them, the better off he would be. And while Izuku was nervous, his explanation didn't win him any points or promises. The instructor very much liked his state of mind. He explained that many of the students his school got voiced a similar hope, a few aiming to put it into heroics, others aiming specifically for the police positions, and others learning it knowing their quirks couldn't help defend themselves, especially if they didn't have the license to use them freely out in public. Izuku need not worry about his reasons to join. They were reasonable and acceptable enough for the school owner and lead instructor to give him a pass and offer him a good luck. The price his mother would have to pay for him to attend regularly each month was discussed and worked out, and when all was said and done, the two Midoriyas waved goodbye with the workings of a smile on their faces. The instructor offered them a seat to stay a while and watch the classes going on so he could be familiar with that, but since the class Izuku wanted to take would be the day following, Izuku promised to stop by and watch that day to get himself familiar with it then. He wanted to keep his focus on defending himself before letting it ease into learning how to fight back, no matter how much his mind edged him on doing so. The rest of the time Izuku had that week, he spent online searching up everything else he needed to know about that he thought would be important. The diet he worked out with his mom wasn't anything too demanding on her wallet, which Izuku was just as grateful for. He didn't want what he was doing to be too much for his mother to handle, and by no means did he want her to run the wallet dry just for him and dream everyone was against. And, letting his mother know and understand, Izuku would spend the time around his studying, sleeping, and jujitsu classes running to help get into shape. Nothing too extreme, just a few laps around the block and near his home, however much he could manage a day when he had the time. He kept to running on the days between his martial arts class. And he did run on those days, usually for an hour to just over half an hour around the block of their apartment. It really put into perspective the first few times just how out of shape he was. And when the jujitsu classes started, the same point was made there. Teaching went slowly the first few days, going over just what the martial art was apart from all the others there were to learn, and the practice they had dug a lot into Izuku's head. His form greatly needed work, which was something he could also be practicing outside of class just to remind himself of what he was learning. It was advice the teacher had passed on the first day for those around Izuku who were struggling too. And Izuku personally had to lose his stiffness problem. He was too hesitant to move and act on the small techniques the teacher was giving them. His grip also needed work. Hand and foot placement also needed work. Most of him needed work, but the instructor he had seemed not offended or angry with him at the dilemma. They were understanding of everyone's problems and promised that the more everyone practiced, the more everyone could overcome those problems. Izuku couldn't remember a teacher as pleasant as her since the one he had in preschool. Izuku straightened his back where he sat and worked on controlling his breathing, bringing air back into his lungs. His classmates were also something else. For the most part, everyone was strange to Izuku, though it was apparently normal by everyone else's standards. No one was really rude to anyone else, and people made friends and conversation in and between practices fairly easily. Only one other kid, someone a bit younger than Izuku, was abrasive with their words, but their instructor was by no means pleased with their attitude and promised to kick the kid from the class if he kept his mouth yapping with those words. Izuku really only interacted with one of the boys in his class, avoid the girls because no one the other boys because they seemed more interested in other things than he was familiar with. Mashireo Ojiro was a fairly nice and interesting boy, being the only one in the class with a mutant quirk, given he had a pretty big tail coming out from under his shirt. The few talks Izuku had with him at the start of all their classes made it clear he was there for almost the exact same reasons Izuku was. He was aiming for hero classes too, and for the same UA high school that the young Midoriya wanted to attend. He was pretty nice too, so Izuku stuck to him for most of the classes and practices they did. Mashireo had to avoid using his tail in most of the exercises until one came up specifically for defending with and against it. A lot of the other kids seemed hesitant to spar with him having a fifth limb in the way, but Izuku jumped to the challenge to partner with him. It gave him someone he was growing more comfortable with near him more often, and learning how to defend against someone who had more experience in martial arts and had a physical quirk that could benefit himself in battle gave Izuku a good challenge to work with and learn for his future endeavors. And when class was over, Mashireo had to wait for his mother to come and pick him up, seeing as how they actually had a car for transport and Izuku only had the rails to move him around. So Izuku decided to keep him company when his mother was running a few minutes late, and the two boys got into discussions about heroics and the specifics of their quirks, or in Izuku's case, the lack thereof. God be forgiven, but Mashireo didn't have any problem with Izuku being quirkless as so many others had been towards the green teen. Mashireo saw himself as practically quirkless, having nothing special but a big tail that, for most of the time in everyday life, just functioned as an extra limb. It wasn't anything special like controlling water or releasing explosions from the palms of his hands, nor did he have enhanced strength or muscle fibers or bones throughout the rest of his body, so for the most part Mashireo saw himself as being a normal kid with a big tail. At least he was nice about it. Izuku set his hands on his knees and pushed himself back up to his feet. It had been a month since he met All Might, nearly died a few times, was told to give up on his dream by numerous big people and a bully, found a bat in a dump of a beach, and worked out with his mother how he could become a hero. He'd taken his jujitsu class for 4 weeks, practicing loosely outside of class when he was alone and trying harder in class to make ends meet, and was slowly working his way to getting the hang of it. He kept running every other day to keep his body growing fit, and had moved his running plan just last week from his neighborhood to the abandoned beach, running along the shoreline back and forth as many times as he could before his body told him he had done enough for the day. At best, that meant from one end to the other and then halfway back. It was a start. Izuku cracked his neck, wincing at the small snap he heard, and moved himself forward in a jog, keeping the sea on his right side and following it along. Kaken had been bothering him less, especially since Izuku was keeping so quiet and introverted about everything he was doing that the blonde had no interest in bothering as often. Every now and again Izuku would hear the snide comment or sneer, but Izuku could put that off. And Mashireo was really nice. The two boys had exchanged numbers and kept small discussions in text whenever they had something to talk about, be it heroes or something they had learned in their self-defense classes. A new friend was a new friend and Izuku appreciated having him. Izuku slowly eased his jog into a run, moving his feet faster and farther a second at a time. His breathing was shortening as his pace moved up, and his arms swung to join his legs. Running was tiring. Really, really tiring. But Izuku liked doing it. He liked running when he had the time, and learning how to throw a punch properly, and practicing yoga-like forms to better his balance. It was bettering him, and he was getting better at doing them. That was what he wanted, and he was happy to be doing them. The only thing he had not done in that month was touch the bat. It sat lonely in his closet, leaning against the wall beneath his shirts, waiting for the day Izuku took it out again. He had seen the various weapons in the martial arts school that was used in other classes, and his instructor had explained that they would practice disarming people who attacked them with a knife or a gun in the future. Those weapons weren't anything similar to the baseball bat, but he would learn how to use those other ones and then learn how to fight against them eventually. God be forgiven, but Mashireo didn't have any problem with Izuku being quirkless as so many others had been towards the green teen. Mashireo saw himself as practically quirkless, having nothing special but a big tail that, for most of the time in everyday life, just functioned as an extra limb. It wasn't anything special like controlling water or releasing explosions from the palms of his hands, nor did he have enhanced strength or muscle fibers or bones throughout the rest of his body, so for the most part Masahiro saw himself as being a normal kid with a big tail. At least he was nice about it. Izuku set his hands on his knees and pushed himself back up to his feet. It had been a month since he met All Might, nearly died a few times, was told to give up on his dream by numerous big people and a bully, found a bat in a dump of a beach, and worked out with his mother how he could become a hero. He'd taken his jujitsu class for 4 weeks, practicing loosely outside of class when he was alone and trying harder in class to make ends meet, and was slowly working his way to getting the hang of it. He kept running every other day to keep his body growing fit, and had moved his running plan just last week from his neighborhood to the abandoned beach, running along the shoreline back and forth as many times as he could before his body told him he had done enough for the day. At best, that meant from one end to the other and then halfway back. It was a start. Izuku cracked his neck, wincing at the small snap he heard, and moved himself forward in a jog, keeping the sea on his right side and following it along. Kaken had been bothering him less, especially since Izuku was keeping so quiet and introverted about everything he was doing that the blonde had no interest in bothering as often. Every now and again Izuku would hear the snide comment or sneer, but Izuku could put that off. And Masahiro was really nice. The two boys had exchanged numbers and kept small discussions in text whenever they had something to talk about, be it heroes or something they had learned in their self-defense classes. A new friend was a new friend and Izuku appreciated having him. Izuku slowly eased his jog into a run, moving his feet faster and farther a second at a time. His breathing was shortening as his pace moved up, and his arms swung to join his legs. Running was tiring. Really, really tiring. But Izuku liked doing it. He liked running when he had the time, and learning how to throw a punch properly, and practicing yoga-like forms to better his balance. It was bettering him, and he was getting better at doing them. That was what he wanted, and he was happy to be doing them. The only thing he had not done in that month was touch the bat. It sat lonely in his closet, leaning against the wall beneath his shirts, waiting for the day Izuku took it out again. He had seen the various weapons in the martial arts school that was used in other classes, and his instructor had explained that they would practice disarming people who attacked them with a knife or a gun in the future. Those weapons weren't anything similar to the baseball bat, but he would learn how to use those other ones and then learn how to fight against them eventually. Izuku let himself smile through his short breaths. He would learn how to fight eventually. He would know how to fight and win eventually. He would get into UA eventually. He would become a hero. Eventually. Swing. Exhale. Roll back. Step. Rise. Inhale. Swing. Exhale. Roll back. Step. Rise. Inhale. Swing. Exhale. Roll back. Step. Rise. Inhale. Swing. Exhale. Izuku kept his eyes forward as the bat fell in an arc, rolling past his feet and barely grazing the sand below before swinging back up to point at the sky. His hips followed it back, feet repositioning themselves apart correctly and giving Izuku a moment to breathe before he let out another swing with an oomph of a breath. Another month gone by, and still so many more changes made to his life. His relationships with his classmates and Kaken were very much non-existent, not like there was a good connection between him and any of them to begin with, so in class he kept himself very reserved. A few times he was caught muttering, but it was muffled beyond understanding and either the person in front or behind him would snap him out of it before the class broke in an uproar about it again. Kaken specifically kept ignoring him, not even bothering to throw an insult his way in or outside of class. And their interactions were cut even more as Izuku kept his exercising outside of the neighborhood. Speaking of which, those had changed within a month's time. Izuku knew what it was like to feel sore, but he never knew how to feel a happy sore, especially when it was his own doing. Alongside his running, Izuku added more exercises and reps to build his body. Push-ups, sit-ups, punching drills, mainly of which was for perfecting his form to fight in the future while still staying out of fights for the time being, knee raises, and some weightlifting. Izuku kept all of his exercising around the beach, practicing on the sand or the pavement a stairways away. He didn't want to work up a sweat in his room or the living room. That would be gross. And the weights he used weren't really weights, as much as they were objects in the trash Izuku was able to lift and carry or push around to work out his muscles more. His birthday was in the middle of August, and he had thought in the weeks building up he would want some weights to give his arms a good workout when he was just in his room and had the spare hand to lift, but something else came up. Izuku had moved his training to the beach, but it wasn't all that better to begin with. While he had more space from people to himself, it was replaced with heaping piles of trash covering a fair portion of the sand and of his site. And it wasn't pleasing, and he understood why so many people decided to avoid it and the beach. The trash had become too big a nuisance, and no one was doing anything to get rid of it. No one stepped up to clean the beach and leave it good as new all over again. And nearly tripping over a microwave gave him idea he'd clean the beach. Izuku wanted to be a hero. He wanted to be a hero who could go out and fight villains and save people and do good deeds and just overall make people feel safe and happy. But that wasn't what all heroes did, nor was it something he could jump into doing anytime soon. Heroes weren't made to fight, they were made to help, and that had no bounds to its meanings. Helping people across the street, helping people escape danger, helping people live, and even helping people clean. If Izuku couldn't act as a hero trying to fight baddies, he could at least act as a hero trying to make the world and the places around him friendlier for all the people. That would be a good mark on his resume. So for his birthday, alongside the hero merchandise and a new notebook or two, Izuku decided to cut some of that and instead ask for a wagon. He had to explain to his mother the reasoning behind it, because a 15-year-old asking for a wagon wasn't a parent's usual expectation. He told her that he looked online and found a proper dump about 12 blocks away from the beach, and she knew about the beach. Izuku decided he would take smaller objects and appliances, whatever weight he could manage, and not something like a fridge. There in fact was a fridge amongst all the beach trash, and he avidly went out of his way to steer clear of it just on a regular basis. No way in hell was he walking across frozen heads in the middle of a beach if he could help it. He wouldn't do anything too strenuous on his body, nor would he stay out too late doing it. He could spend probably the weekends only, and maybe sometime on Friday when he was exercising moving trash over and work at the piles little by little. Community service was heroic, and if he wanted to be a hero, he could at least do that. No fighting was involved, so the most danger he had was getting sore and maybe only once kinda dropping something on his foot. Inko was much more reluctant to agree to that idea, thinking and arguing with her son calmly that he was putting too much pressure and work on his body, more than he needed to for getting into UA. Izuku argued reasonably that he wouldn't do anything to destroy his body and stunt his growth, training, and such, and he would keep his dwindling of the trash under careful watch to only do as much as he could. He wasn't pressed for time to clean the beach, so he would work only as much as he could to clean it. It really wasn't an argument as much as it was mother and son fretting over the other and their hyper reactions to everything they were discussing. Lucky him, he got a wagon. Getting it on the rail from home to the beach and back was an awkward two-way trip he was still getting used to, and the people riding with him were probably trying to adjust as well. He kept to his promise to only go on the weekends with the wagon and had spent a few days already moving trash over to the dump, having several breaks in between trips to rest his arms from the amount of stress the whole ordeal was putting them under. It was still a welcomed feeling, knowing sore meant he was training his body right and he was only conditioning himself to get used to it. He told Masahiro the following class what he was doing, and the tailed boy was both surprised and impressed at the idea. It wasn't something he thought of doing, though it was a good thing. Sadly, he couldn't join in. Izuku had opened up the invitation if the other boy wanted to join him to help or just hang out at the beach, but the blonde boy had much a busy schedule, what with his exercising and training, his school work and grades he had to make sure met expectations, and all the family times and outings he had with his parents. His mother had promised they could try to work something out, but Izuku didn't want them to have to ruin any of their plans to do so. It wasn't too big a loss for Izuku that he couldn't spend more time with his friend outside of the self-defense classes, but it did dishearten him slightly. Izuku swung the bat towards the sand again, giving himself a moment of rest and breath in the middle of his practice. Speaking of the martial arts classes, Izuku was happy to see some improvement in them. He had been just about 2 months in his practicing, and while his body structure grew and improved, so did his performance in sparring. Masahiro could still sweep him off his feet in free sparring and takedowns, but at least in the scripted practice his muscles and joints were loosening. He could flow more freely from a stand to a crouch, was finding it easier to lift someone onto his hip and bring them to the ground, though the weight was still a milestone he had to overcome, and diverting and dodging punches were fun and becoming easier to react and deflect. His other classmates were the same, if his instructor's words of appreciation to them as a whole meant anything. And the abrasive boy was growing less abrasive, though the small comment of his awesomeness and how much better he could do what his classmates did would come out in a whisper. He just never went out of his way to try and prove it with the intent of doing so. And while they still had yet to tackle weapons, another gift came to Izuku on his birthday, permission to use his bat, given some restrictions. Inko decided to lift her embargo on Izuku actually using the bat for something, but she kept the restriction on him using it against anyone, especially since he could easily hurt someone more than he would want to if he didn't know how to fight properly. Izuku accepted that, and his first order of business in using the bat was just to familiarize himself with it. He'd watched some videos and read some training articles on using weapons like eskrima sticks and swords and staffs, and the first matter they addresses was learning how to handle each weapon. Get familiar with the weight distribution and the right grip and the movement of the weapon in each possible movement. Find a movement to practice and play on repeat until it's natural. So Izuku did just that. He would take the bat to the beach and practice swinging the bat, treating it like a normal bat that anyone else would, and getting his arms used to the new weight of a metal distorted cylinder he wanted to use for heroics. If the heat in his arms were any indication, he was doing it right. The bat was growing less strenuous just to pick up, and Izuku was too. Embarrassed by the idea of celebrating for growing muscles on the pencils he had coming out of his shoulders just a number of weeks ago. The green-haired teen took a large gasp of air as his grip eased off the bat and kept it hanging by his leg from only one. Swinging the bat was good and all, but after a while it did feel somewhat boring. Maybe he should buy some baseballs to practice with. Help improve hand-eye coordination and response times. Would also be pretty harmless if he's practicing on the beach a good distance away from the homes on mainland. Izuku rolled his spine straight with a slight crack in sound, giving the sea another look and a smile through his sweat before turning away. To find someone watching him. Gah! Izuku jumped back with a spin of his hands, dropping the bat in his hands and startling the boy sitting on the stairs watching him. My apologies, the other boy announced, jumping to his own feet and taking a step down and closer to Izuku. Are you all right? Izuku on his part was recovering fast, placing a hand on his chest as he calmed down with his breath. Why yes, I'm fine, he manages to speak to the taller boy in the blue tracksuit. "Why, you startled me. Didn't hear you come up. My deepest apologies." The tall boy made his way down the last few steps to the sand and fell into a stiff bow. Izuku blinked, his surprise staying as the other boy continued. "I did not mean to scare you. I came out of my way to the beach to confirm what my brother had told me about this place. I had no intention of frightening you with my unannounced presence." No, it's fine. Why, you don't have to apologize." Izuku kept his hands shaking in front of him with a smile to match. On the inside of his head, he couldn't help but kick himself. He finally had a friend, one in the form of a blonde boy with a tail, but actually talking to other people outside of him was always a crutch. Especially now that someone had come across his training with the bat. He gulped down what nerves he could and carried on. "So you came here because your brother." The other boy shot back up straight, giving Izuku a small jump in his shoulders as the boy turned his attention to the green teen. "Right," the taller teen announced, shooting a hand forward in a very flat and stiff form. "My brother had told me about this beach before, and the state it had become over the few years. I had never come out here to see it myself before, but now that I do." The taller boy turned his hip, facing one of the trash piles and raising his hand to fix the pair of glasses over his nose. "I see why my brother had said it wasn't bringing in anyone's attention." Izuku swallowed again, licking his lips and nodding his head slowly. "Why, yeah, it does look bad." The young Midoriya turned his head to look at the trash piles with the taller boy. The tide picked up a lot of the trash to begin with, but no one really bothered to clean it up, and since there aren't that many attractions around here, not a lot of people had the interest in coming here to swim or relax to being with, and knowing the state of society, there's probably more people than not without time on their hands to spend going to the beach, so the trash just kept building up to the point people would avidly avoid coming here at all, and when anyone does come around it's just to drop off more trash, which in hindsight is pretty lazy of them when there's a dump a couple of blocks to the east. You seem quite familiar with the beach." Izuku jumped in place without leaving the ground, turning his head back to the other boy. Said teen had changed the expression of his face from the slightly saddened face to a different kind of frown that Izuku was trying to decipher. "Do you perhaps live in the city here?" No, I don't. I live on another edge of town. I've just been coming here often." Izuku could feel the sweat still rolling down his face, and for the life of him he wasn't sure which bead was from the training and which was from his nerves. He turned away from the other boy to his bag in the sand, dropping in a crouch and diving through it to pull out a towel and smother his face with it. "Oh. I see you are out here to train?" Izuku nodded against his towel instead of giving the boy another verbal response. That stupid stutter still needed work. "I must say, I wouldn't have expected a place such as this as an area I would have considered training in. But then again, it would be wrong of me to say I know much about the sport of baseball." A few moments of silence passed until Izuku lowered the towel on his face, just below his eyes, so he could blink against air instead of cotton, and turn his neck to the other boy, sharing with him a look of wide eyes full of confusion on both ends. The other boy opened his mouth to speak, but he cut himself short, moving his hands to rest on his hips before he did actually talk. "I'm sorry to ask, but did I say something out of line?" His tone sounded genuine, just as confused as his look. "If you were planning on keeping your practicing private by using a beach that people do not come to populate anymore, then I do formally apologize for having interrupted you." "No." Izuku shot his hands out to the other boy before he could bow again, dropping the towel into his lap. Not even a second later did the volume of his voice register in his own ears before his hands darted back over his mouth to let his voice reset. "No, I don't play baseball. I'm not practicing or training for it. Oh. The boy's rigid movements seemed to translate to the rest of his body as he, as far as Izuku could tell, was struggling to find the right words. My apologies for presuming. I just thought with the swings you were making and the way your form was, you were practicing to be up to bat, I think it goes? I wouldn't know, Izuku confessed, face heating up as he looked down at the bat behind him. I am not actually into baseball. But then why would you have one? A bat, I mean. Izuku gulped again, reaching over for the bat and pulling it over to rest by his legs. I'm actually. He breathed a big wisp of air, giving it several seconds to rest in his chest before letting it all back out with words to follow. I'm training to be a hero. The boy continued his curious look as Izuku kept talking. I am training out here with a baseball bat because I plan on using it to be a hero, so I need to treat it like a tool and a weapon, and like all weapons I should at least learn to handle it first and get used to carrying it around, and since it's a baseball bat and I promised my mom I wouldn't get into combat fighting or anything dangerous again, I thought it would be best to use it as a regular bat and get my body used to its weight distribution and size any batter would instead of going about it like a hero would while practicing self-defense instead of offensive combat, but once she allows it and I've trained my arms more to handle the weight and it feels comfortable in my hands, I'll learn how to use it like a bow staff or a sword to not only protect myself but use it in combat offensively as well. Izuku's voice drifted with the dust in the wind as he caught the boy's eyes again, staring at him through the glass resting upon his nose in a look of shock and surprise. Yeah, his muttering didn't go away, and to his unfortunate luck it never let up either. He could feel his face growing warmer as he ducked it to his chest and mumbled out an apology. Though apparently that didn't reach the other boy's ears as he began talking. It sounds like you've put quite the amount of thought into using it for heroics, the tall boy admitted, placing a hand on his hips and the other over his chest. I wouldn't have thought to use something like that for a role in heroics, but your commitment to it sounds marvelous. I commend you for your idea. Besides, somehow the boy straightened his posture even higher, I'm looking to go into heroics myself, so I would hope to see you there too. Why you are? Izuku's head rose slightly to the other boy, looking up to his from the highest point his eyes could roll to. But of course. My brother is actually a pro hero, and I've been learning a lot from him to be able to become one myself and make him proud. I'm going to test to get into UA next year. As the boy in blue smiled with pride to the boy in green, the latter rose his head higher, breathing out the heat building in his cheeks. Why your brother is a hero. The boy in glasses nodded, taking a step forward and gesturing to the sand before Izuku asking to sit, which the green team nodded a bit too quickly to let him know he could. My brother in Ingenium. I've only been to his hero office a few times, but at home he's been able to teach me a lot from his own experience. Ingenium? I know of him. Izuku furrowed his eyebrows as he conditioned his mind to move on with the subjects changing before him. He's the hero with engines in his arm to keep him slightly above the ground and move at pretty fast speeds. He's pretty cool as a hero. His armor is similar to a knight's, isn't it? Yes it is, the boy in blue confirmed, turning his legs over just slightly for Midoriya to actually take notice of the pipes coming out of the back of his legs. My quirk is similar to his, though it is positioned on different limbs of our bodies. It does look a lot like the engines on his forearms. A hand stroked Izuku's chin lightly, itching to take out a notebook and write down what he could about it before the boy spoke up again. And what of your quirk? Izuku froze at the question, and like the crashing waves behind him, the harsh reality he lived in came rolling back and washed over his small moment of peace. I. He pressed his mouth into a line, looking not at the boy or the sand, but just ahead at the nervousness playing in his mind. I don't have a quirk. He flinched and curled in on instinct, sitting in wait for the insults of his deficiency and worthlessness to come flying out of the other boy's mouth, riding on the laughter that other boys would present him with. But that didn't come. "You're quirkless?" One look at the taller boy in Izuku could tell he was more confused than literally every other emotion and reaction the green teen was expecting out of him. "I had assumed you had a strength-based quirk, which was why you were using the bat, to complement the amount of power and momentum you could put into each swing, which sounded ideal for a sport like baseball and then just as useful when you said it was heroics." "Why yeah, I don't have a strength quirk, or any." His fingers were dry as they rubbed along the fabric of his pants, still on edge waiting for the boy to turn into the rest of the world. "I'm just using the bat to help get into heroics. Kind of, in place of a quirk, I guess, to do more than I would with just my regular strength." The other boy was silent for a moment, which did absolutely jack to ease Izuku's nerves, and crossed his arms against his chest. "I believe I understand what you are getting at, having a tool or device on hand to make up for where you would lack in comparison to other people and their quirks. Though, and sorry if it sounds rude of me, I mean no intent by it, I am confused as to why a bat and not a sword or staff as you had mentioned." Izuku let his mouth moisten up to speak again as the boy's words took to the register in his head. He wasn't going to berate him? He sounded so calm about it, so did he actually not mind Izuku not having a quirk? That didn't sound right. Everyone else did. Then the question clicked in his head, and a line Mashireo had told him when he learned about the bat played over his tongue. "Well, if I'm not going to have any special powers to stand out, might as well go with the unconventional." The boy blinked at the advice passed on before jolting his back upright in an instant. "That is an excellent idea. The hero world is full of very diverse heroes, especially in their presentation on the field. It only makes sense to keep yourself noticeable with something that would be unique to your style." His head turned to the side with a scoff. "How could I have not guessed that sooner?" Izuku blinked in his own confusion to the other boy's quips before collecting himself and turning back to the green teen. "So you are planning on being a hero too?" It wasn't really a question, it didn't sound like one. It seemed the tall boy was just saying it out loud to remind himself of the detail. "Does that mean you will be applying for heroics at UA? Yes, I am. Or, at least I'm hoping to. I know they opened up the tests for quirkless students to apply, but I still have training to do before I can take the tests. Then it's lucky we have just over 7 months to catch up. I have some training of my own I need to work with, and it seems I need to do some more studying as well." "Why yeah." Izuku didn't really want to end the conversation, he did, but he didn't want to come off as rude about it. But the sun catching his eye inching closer to the building in the distance caught his attention. "Oh, it's getting late. I have to get home, my mom's expecting me soon." The taller boy turned his head back to his shoulder, giving the sun a glance from the corner of his eye. "I'd best be doing the same. My brother should be arriving home from his office as well. It would be better of me than to keep my family waiting." The two boys rose from the sand, one composing himself straight as the other fumbled about to collect his things and have them together. The taller one took a step forward with a hand leading his direction. "It has been a pleasure to, I just realized we never introduced ourselves." For a moment his composure fell apart, but his body shook as the hand darted back to him and landed against his chest, just as Izuku was stretching his own shaking hand to meet it. "My name is Tenya Ida. It is a pleasure to meet you." The hand came forward again, and Izuku let his own continue its momentum to meet it in the middle and give it an awkward shake in his blush and surprise. "I Izuku Midoriya. And nice to meet you too." The shaking went on for a few more seconds before they both let go and made their way up the stairs together. At the top, as Izuku turned away to book it to the railway system home, he was stopped by the young Ida brother. "Will you be coming back to this beach another day?" Izuku blinked to start his response before blushing again as he actually decided to answer with words. "Why, yes. I come here every other day and over the weekends. And no one else comes here, so it's an open place to train, well, aside from the garbage. Yes, that is quite abundant here." Tenya gave the trash a look from the corners of his eyes before letting them fall to Izuku again. "Well, then, I may stop by another day. It was nice to have met you, Midoriya. Have a good night." The tall boy gave the green teen a salute before turning on heel and starting to jog into his run back home. Izuku watched after him, stone in his spot as he eased himself to understand everything that had happened. "And nice to meet you as well, Ida." His eye flinched from the sun above and the promise to his mom to be home played again in his head and had him booking it to the rails to catch the next one home in time. Ida seemed like a nice person, Izuku thought as ran through the blocks. A bit rigid and formal, but he seemed not to mind Izuku's quirkless diagnosis. Maybe Ida would come to the beach again. This is the end. Don't worry, if you like the video, there will be plenty to come.